everybody. I thought I was going to have a nice casual chat with 5 or 10 folks tonight about I still would love us to be able to have some discussion, and so I'll get through my presentation and then particularly think about some of the local implications of this talk. I'm going to talk tonight about what I would consider sort of one of the lesser-known aspects of the climate change discussion. We hear an awful lot of discussion about things like the future of coal and energy in this country, but I'm going to talk tonight about the role that nature and land can play in addressing the climate change issue. It's a great topic to talk about because it is actually a positive message. There's incredible opportunity there about things we can be doing that will make the places we live and work a better place, creating an economic opportunity and creating a range of new benefits for that. I will start, though, by giving a bit of a global context for where we are in the climate change debate now, and it'll help put the work I'm talking about in context, and I think will give you a picture of where I perceive the world and the United States are heading right now with some of the decisions going. So we'll start there. I think that this talk might feel a little bit more global than some of the more local talks you get here, but I will come back down to what the local connections are, particularly our land use issues here in Colorado and in Route County in the Yampa Valley. So we'll do that. Let me start by talking a little bit about the Nature Conservancy. I was very privileged to serve as the state director of the Nature Conservancy in Colorado before I took this job. Steamboat, those two went together. I quit that job so I could move to Steamboat and do this work on climate change. I'm very excited to be here. Many of you, I imagine maybe all of you in this area know the Nature Conservancy through the work of we've done here on land protection and the great work at the Carpenter Ranch. We're lucky to have Betsy Blakely here and Sarah Blakely from the Carpenter Ranch. We also have Gary Neal, who's a trustee of the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy that's in place in Milner. And we have a special guest, a trustee from the Alaska chapter, Brian Rogers, who happens to be visiting from Fairbanks. So we have some great Nature Conservancy assets here. There's some material there. And if you want to learn more about the work here and get engaged with the Nature Conservancy, find Betsy after the talk. So the mission of the Nature Conservancy is to protect the lands and waters upon which all life depends. We've been in the conservation business for more than 60 years. We're celebrating our 50th year here in Colorado, and most of our work started out as a more traditional land conservation organization. Over the years, that's grown to think about how does land and nature have a relationship to how it benefits people, and how can we enhance people's lives and livelihoods by protecting nature has grown as a driving force for the work of the Nature Conservancy. But you might ask, why should the Nature Conservancy worry about conservation and land and sort of non-political activities be engaged in a problem like climate change, which at times feels like an overly political discussion, and particularly in the United States. And there's two important reasons. The first is that climate change truly does affect the work that we've done over the years. The conservation work is greatly impacted by what we're seeing as the changes in our climate. I can talk about those a little bit, but that's not going to be the focus of my talk. But the ability of nature to continue to provide the benefits that we all derive from it, whether it's through food production, whether it's through recreation, are gravely threatened by the prospects of climate change, not only here in the United States, but even more so around the world. So that's reason number one. And the second reason is the purpose of my talk today. We really believe that investments in nature can be our best immediate path to addressing the challenge of climate change, the carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And so it's that aspect of it that nature could actually be a solution that also brings the Nature Conservancy to this issue. So we'll talk about that today. So I am not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to give this talk from the presumption that climate change is real and that it's a problem and that we should be doing something about it. We can talk at the end if you want to have a discussion about any of those 3 points. But I think I like to think that we're beginning to move into an era of not debating whether we should do something about climate change, but how we do something about it. And it's that discussion about how that really matters, because there is and there will always be uncertainty about what the impacts are going to be. I think it's fairly, most of the scientific discussion would suggest that the costs of not doing anything about climate change are much greater than the costs of doing something about it. But even in that space of how we do something about climate change, there's an incredible range of opportunities, costs, impacts that are going to change, people that are affected, and so that discussion about, unfortunately in this country, we haven't had enough discussion about how. Because how we address it, how we do it in a way that helps address people's jobs, people's livelihoods, protects the assets that we have invested in through conservation over the years, really is a very important discussion, and frankly we've just had too little of it. It's in that space that I want to focus tonight. But as I said, I'm going to start by giving you a global context. I'm sure all of you right here tonight were aware of the conference of the parties to the UN Convention on Climate Change that met in Paris just a month ago and concluded an agreement that those of us that work in the climate space truly believe is groundbreaking, even though we've been at this climate change convention work for a long time, since the Rio Convention in the 1980s. What happened in Paris was truly different. And one of the things that I think, if we want to still have a debate about climate change, what happens because of Paris, once this is enacted, and it will be in a few months when enough countries sign it, will be international law that we are going to work together to reduce climate change greenhouse gas emissions. 187 countries have committed to do something about climate change. That is pretty amazing, and to stand up and say we're not going to be one of what the rest of the world is doing, I think would not be a very wise piece of international diplomacy for the United States. So I think the commitments we've made in Paris are going to stand. What makes Paris interesting is that it is a bottom-up. It is what can you do, it's sort of what can you do for the world that all the countries have stepped up to do. And given that it wasn't mandatory and there weren't binding reductions imposed on the world, it is really truly amazing what countries stepped up to. Not only the developed world, but the developing world, countries like Brazil and Mexico, and even India and China, which we hear a lot about, really made amazing commitments to say they were going to change the way they produce energy and to move forward. And it's for that reason of this commitment that is being made by these countries that I think the world really is a different place right now in terms of the climate change. That said, there will be a lot of distractors from it, and I know in the back it'll be hard to see this graphic, but we don't pay attention to the numbers. Basically, the point is that this general trend here is showing that if we did nothing, that's the path that we're probably on, which shows up to about a 4 degree centigrade increase in global average temperature, which is well above the level at which we would see substantial, likely catastrophic impacts from changes in weather patterns around the world. I mean, the scientists can't even quite project out how bad that's going to be, and have focused a little bit more on what would happen if we got to a different level. So the goal that the world has set is somewhere less than a 2 degree centigrade increase in global average temperatures. That's, that number gets thrown around. That obviously is a global average temperature on an annual basis, so it doesn't mean anything in terms of what's going to happen tomorrow, but it is the level at which we can begin to project and understand what some of the impacts might be in terms of melting ice sheets, changes in precipitation, and some of the other impacts. We're currently at a little less than 1 degree centigrade increase in global average annual temperature since the early 1900s, and we're already beginning to see some changes in weather patterns that have substantial impacts. But we focus sometimes on what is happening today, and really what we're trying to avoid is much worse than what we're seeing today. I think we're not trying to address climate change to fix what's happening today. We're trying to address climate change to avoid maybe things in the middle and in the future. what's interesting is that the agreements in Paris, what countries put on the table, only get us about halfway to that goal. So even though it's sort of a landmark agreement and never been seen before, it isn't addressing even the substantive part of the problem. So we have a long ways to go. And one of the questions is, where do we come up with, what are the ways that we get from this line to something like this? And my answer tonight will be that a lot of that is going to be lays in what we can do with the land base. And then, this is my last graph, I promise. Actually, I have one more, sorry. But I won't do it. This is looking at the United States picture and asking, so, this is where we are today. You can see we've already begun to dip down. A lot of that is because of the shifting from coal to natural gas in the electrical sector. So this has happened without direct regulatory pressure, but more from just economic changes that have been happening. This was our forecast to growth in energy if we did nothing. And now with some of the mix of energy sectors, particularly renewable energy growing and natural gas growing, we're there. These two stars are what the United States committed to in the Paris Agreement. And we have mostly in this country identified how to get from here to here, not completely though. And so a lot of that is in some of the regulations that have been discussed that you'll hear about, called the Clean Power Plan, regulating from a clean air perspective, the electrical generation sector. That gets you about, this number here is about 26 to 28% below 2005 levels. So that electrical sector regulation gets you about 7 or 8% of that total. Some of the other regulations that have been proposed, landfill methane regulations, new regulations on heavy-duty trucks that are already in the works, get you further there. Regulation of fluorocarbons, which are still being produced, have a significant impact. So we've got a bundle of things that get us there, but we don't actually yet even have in the United States identified how to get here. I'll talk a little bit about what we can do in agriculture. Secretary Vilsack of the USDA has put out a plan that gets you about 2% of this gap from the land-based work, and those are the kinds of things I'll talk about. But the fact is we need to figure out more here, and we have really no plan to get to here, which is where if we're going to meet those objectives of keeping us in safe global temperatures, the United States needs to do that. So an additional 90 billion tons of reduction against an average of about 8 billion or 7 billion tons a year coming out of the U.S. Emission sector now. So it's an enormous amount, and there's really probably no way to get there unless we begin to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is what land-based solutions are. We likely will have great increases in renewable energy through technology advances and innovation and whatnot, but even that probably doesn't get us there, at least on current projections. So while Paris changed the world, we still haven't figured out how to solve the problem. So that brings me to what I want to put on the table, is this question of what can we get out of the land base, which is about reducing emissions that come currently from land uses, agriculture, forestry, particularly is what I'm going to be talking about, and as well as improving practices so that we actually go and pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. I hope I don't have to give a biology lesson. We understand plants photosynthesize, carbon dioxide comes in, oxygen goes out, that carbon dioxide gets built into biomass, but more importantly, gets put into the soil. And we have, there's still more carbon, CO2 equivalent by far in the soil than in any other part of the global system. The atmosphere, certainly more in the soil than there are in standing biomass. But that is, but we've also lost about 70% of that soil carbon that was there before humans started plowing the earth primarily and clearing it for things. So we've lost a lot of soil carbon over the years. We're not going to get it all back because we've changed a lot of the face of the earth, but we can get a lot of it back. And that's where we can get to this. So the 20% is a conservative, pragmatic estimate of what could be done using existing technology we know today, land use practices, and We'll talk a little bit about what some of those look like. That number, there are people that can suggest that number could go as high as 50 to 60% of the total emissions could come from changes in our land use sector. And there are even some people that think that through certain land practices we could get 100% of the carbon out by putting it back into the soil. Those numbers, the high-end numbers, just don't seem to be overly practical. And even at the 20%, we have a scale problem. We know how to do it. You give us an acre, and I know a lot of you ranchers and farmers here, on any acre of land could put soil carbon back in. But how do we get that to happen at the scale that's needed to get 20% of human emissions? Is really one of our challenges. One of the other reasons to talk about focusing on that piece of the solution, the 20% of the solution that is focused on land-based, is that we get an awful lot else by focusing on it. By improved land use, restoration, management, we can continue to protect wildlife habitat and biodiversity, particularly if a lot of that is preventing the cutting down of tropical forests. We get better water quality. You see that in a state like Colorado, where our forests are the source of our water supply and the water quality and quantity from doing that, even truer elsewhere. We produce food, fiber, and energy, biomass energy from this sector, so you're actually producing things that we're going to need. You create jobs, particularly in rural areas where land use is going to happen. And then perhaps one of the most important aspects of focusing on this aspect of the climate mitigation question is that we can help protect ourselves from those changes that we're already beginning to see and are certainly going to see more of in the future. Can we be more resilient to drought? Can we be more resilient to flooding? Those two in particular can be addressed by healthy natural systems. Sea level rise, a lot of that can be addressed by healthier coastal wetlands and coral reefs and oyster beds and things like that. So focusing on this part of the climate solution not only helps us in ways that perhaps the technology sector can't ever help us, but it also produces all of these other benefits, and that's another reason that we would like to talk about this. A third reason, or second, is cost. This is going to cost money, and we'll talk about how we get that. The kinds of changes we do in land use need investments, but these are investments that are much cheaper than some of the other technological solutions you'll hear about, like carbon capture and storage in coal plants, which is one way to take carbon out of the air. It's unclear how much that costs because we haven't yet quite found a way to make that feasible, but it's certainly closer to $100 a ton or more of the kind of reductions you can get. A lot of the practices that I'm talking about here, if they result in better productivity for a ranch, for example, or more high-quality timber, can actually pay for themselves, so in a sense they're free. So you are beginning to look at a very different part of the cost curve than you normally hear talked about. And then finally, the last thing, and this is my last draft, and this one I'll stay on quickly, is that we can invest in nature today. And that's sort of this green line here that suggests we change the trajectory of the carbon emissions from the land sector. Right now, it's about 20% or 25% of the global emissions are actually coming from land. So right now, land is a net source of carbon dioxide at a global level, or greenhouse gas emissions. On an annual basis, there's still a huge sink there, but the annual flux is coming from it. But if we turn that around and bring it down, you change the need to change the energy sector from this kind of drastic, quick drop. If your goal is carbon neutrality by 2080, 2100, which is what the world says we need to be on, and that's included in the Paris Agreement, if you're saying that's where you're going to be by the end of the century, you either need to drop your energy use much more quickly, or we can find a more phased way into it. So this gap in the shaded area is the difference between investing in nature today rather than just counting on the energy sector and the transportation sector and other things you have. So those are the three key reasons to do this. Co-benefits, other good things that happen, cost, and time, the fact that we can get there sooner. So those are those arguments. So let's then talk about what this means, and I know a lot of you in this room have probably thought about this and have other ideas. I'm going to keep this at a high level and would love to have a discussion about things you've seen working. here. But these are the three broad categories that we need to do. One is find some ways to avoid conversion of high carbon land systems. This is primarily about changing the path of deforestation in tropical countries, and that's where a lot of the focus coming out of Paris is. There was a commitment to put $100 billion a year of investment from the developed world into the developing world for things like preventing deforestation, for investing in climate adaptation, and even beginning to transition in the developing world to renewable energy. But a lot of the focus is on this commitment to prevent land conversion. But we have land conversion happening in the United States. We have land conversion happening in Round County. Keeping that carbon in the soil and natural systems is one of the most important things we can do. The second big category is improving land management. This is mainly in the forestry sector and the agricultural sector. This is about changing practices to focus on optimizing, not just on production or economics, but optimizing around environmental benefits at the same time. And are there ways to change practices? An easiest one to get a head around is in a forestry and a commercial forestry operation, changing the rotation length between when you're cutting down trees. By lengthening it a little bit, you're keeping carbon there. You're still producing timber off of those lands, but you're doing it in a way that sequesters carbon. The other example, we'll talk a bit about this in the Colorado context, is ranching. Are there ways to change grazing patterns, change the timing and duration to focus on putting soil back, carbon back into that soil by building plant growth up and building bigger. This is particularly important on lands that have been overgrazed in the past, where you have a great opportunity to change grazing practices to focus on soil carbon. And then in agriculture, there's a range of strategies, a lot of them around things that I'm sure you talk about in this series a lot, around the concepts of sustainable agriculture, organic agriculture, no-till agriculture, reduced fertilizer use, a whole range of our activities to change that. So that's the second big pillar. And the third, and perhaps one of the most inspiring one, is this question of restoration. We have an opportunity to restore land that's been degraded, land that's been deforested, land that's been overgrazed. This is a chance to create a restoration economy that a lot of people have talked about over the years. But now we have a chance maybe to use the global commitment to climate change mitigation to invest in a restoration economy. Jobs that exist about how to restore wetlands, how to plant trees, how to bring grasslands back that have been overgrazed and degraded. An enormous opportunity there, and many of the tons reside in. The three key ecosystems in Colorado, pretty much any place on the earth has a piece of them all, as forests, as I talked about, grasslands and croplands in terms of what we can do there, and then wetlands, which the other two categories cover a lot more land area, but wetlands have much more potential bang for the buck in terms of per acre work, and that includes riparian wetlands, coastal wetlands, and other things. So what are the types of practices? So those are the three big categories and three big systems. We've done an analysis. This is actually not, this is brand new science that the Nature Conservancy has done, and said, okay, what do we know about the global extent of these systems and the applicability of those practices and how we could pay for them, and how much could we get out of applying what we already know today on areas where that's logical? That's where the 20% comes to, which works out to about 13 billion tons of, on an annual basis, about 20% of our thing. You can see, we won't go into the details, the green bars here are forest-related categories. So forests, and particularly tropical forests, are key, and the biggest block is not cutting down those forests in the first place. The other is planting new forests, and these down here are more about changing practices to use them better. The beigeish colors here are more grassland and cropland related, and the big one here is in restoring degraded lands, to restoring degraded lands that have become desertified, can no longer produce crops, and what you can do there. Restoring and building agroforestry systems where you're working with trees and crops at the same time. That potential is enormous. Again, that's probably a little bit more in tropical countries and developing countries than in the United States, but there's a piece of that here. And then these are ones that certainly do apply in the United States and in places like Colorado. One is cropland practices, nutrient management, no-till, cover crops. I won't go into all of them there. The potential to sequester more carbon in existing rangelands and grazing lands is perhaps one of the biggest unknowns on this chart, because this is a pretty conservative estimate of what you could do. If any of you have heard Alan Savory give a talk, who would claim that he could solve the entire climate change problem through land grazing, just by grazing cows and using cattle as a tool to put soil in the carbon, carbon in the soil. This is probably a more realistic sliver, but I do believe that number could go high. One of the things that I always like to say about improving grazing lands is that if we can produce food on grazing lands in ways that actually sequester carbon, we end up having that double benefit, because you're now producing food, calories, protein, that you don't have to produce in plowing up new land, cutting down new trees, particularly in tropical forests, where a lot of that forest loss is being driven by a desire to move cattle operations in there. So improving grazing not only gets you this here, but it helps you with these other things and avoiding them too. So that's a significant part of that whole picture. And then avoiding grassland loss is actually very important. We're not seeing much grassland loss in Colorado anymore. We're still losing some grasslands, but in the Great Plains, the Central Great Plains, the Northern Great Plains, there's still an enormous amount of grassland being converted to corn. Which is just one of our biggest sources of land-based carbon in this country here. So this is the global picture of the opportunities, and in each of those slices, there are interesting questions about how do we pay for it, how do we incentivize it, do we know the science, do we know the practice, and can we go forward? And we can talk about that in the context of Colorado. Again, the benefits that are associated with doing this work cut across not just the climate thing, but they're what we would call the triple bottom line you'll hear talk about: ecological benefits, economic benefits from productive land, and social benefits, particularly in areas where you're bringing cropland or productive agricultural land back from a degraded condition. The social benefits are enormous for people, but you see this even in this country. I'll give you a case study that the Conservancy has worked on. We've worked with a group of ranchers out in eastern Colorado, Yuma County. It's about the polar opposite of Round and Moffett County on the other side of the state, and it feels a lot different. But there's a group of ranchers. Things are tough out in Yuma County. They've been tough for a while. It's a mixed wheat growing, corn growing, and cattle growing. But we've been working with a group there called the Three Rivers Alliance, who have been very focused on this question about this triple bottom line. What could we do to change the way we manage our lands here to improve those three sectors? And by focusing on this, combining a little bit of restoration around wetlands, changing grazing practices to focus on long-term health for wildlife, in this case prairie chickens and as a target species, and other species in the grassland out there. Starting out by just trying to address these three themes, which we've had some great success at helping them with practices, what we're getting is this fourth benefit. So we're getting incredible soil, but we're measuring it now. I shouldn't say incredible. We're projecting that there will be enormous new soil carbon being built on those ranches due to the productivity we're seeing in the grasses and losing some of the bare soil that's been there. You get this climate benefit. So in a sense, you could focus on just those three other elements and hope to get a climate benefit. Or by paying and driving the climate benefit, we can get the others. So before I talk about other Colorado examples, one big question here is, how does this happen? What's this going to take? How do we pay for it? Because changing practices is not easy. There often need to be incentives. The one thing that is interesting about this compared to everything else in the climate debate is that I don't think anyone is talking significantly about regulation, and particularly the agricultural section, for climate, for carbon. It's almost impossible to do because every farm is different, every ranch is different. It would not be politically popular, there's no question about that, and I imagine that that is not the path we'll go. So we're talking here, unlike the other sectors, whether it's landfills or power plants or trucks and cars, we're not talking about a regulatory approach. So we have to be talking about incentives. How do we create financial incentives, technological, knowledge transfer incentives to landowners and ranchers to do this sort of work? And there's two buckets to be thinking about. One of them is in business models, market incentives that are not driven by policy but are driven by the market. One of the most interesting one is probably a lot of the work that's happening in supply chain discussions. You've got big companies, Walmart, Cargill, Kellogg, big ag corporations that are beginning to say, we're going to move towards carbon neutrality in what we do. They're going to send a signal down the supply chain that if you produce food in ways that are meeting some of these climate goals or these carbon goals, we're going to pay a premium, hopefully, and that will create an incentive. And that's probably the cleanest way for doing this. You're seeing this in sectors like sustainable forestry, sustainable wool production, lots of areas where there's a premium being offered for food products, food and fiber that are produced in this context. So that's one sector. We have a lot of ways to innovate there. One of the exciting things is the idea that some of these practices will pay for themselves over time, but they cost money up front. So are there ways to have new innovative finance opportunities coming in to pay for that upfront cost and be paid back as the productivity goes up over time? A lot of that money that's being put on the table for the developing countries around the world is in that form. It's in finance that can help jumpstart the restoration economy and others with the presumption that over time they'll pay for them. And then there's this concept of a carbon market, which hasn't taken off the way that many people might have thought it would have 10 years ago, where we have a market for reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and we can pay them to landowners to do it on their land, or you can pay for it at the power plant. I actually think the concept of carbon markets is probably almost begun to pass its time in this context, because we're getting to a point, if you go back to the graphs and I showed those big gaps, we need to get the reductions from both the electricity and energy sector and the land sector, and you can't trade those off and get those big gaps. We can use carbon markets to jumpstart some of these activities, but they're less likely to be the answer over the long term, because we're going to need to find ways to pay for both of them. And then in the policy bucket, I mean, our biggest tool here in the United States is programs like the Farm Bill, where we are investing in agriculture and land use. We have forestry programs that are doing it. I mentioned before the Secretary of Agriculture has put out 10 building blocks under existing programs. And there are things like using the Conservation Reserve Program, the CRP program, which retires land from agriculture to focus on carbon benefits, to promote optimized fertilizer use in agriculture, to promote no-till and covered crops where that makes sense. So through the Farm Bill, there'll be an enormous opportunity to do that, but we have to continue to think about policy innovations that find ways to pay for it. We're going to end up paying to deal with the problem of climate change. It's not going to happen for free. I believe, and I think most scientists would believe, that the cost it's going to take to address the problem are much less than the cost of not addressing it. But can we put some of that money we're paying into these sectors where we're getting all these multiple co-benefits as well? And then I'll just close by talking about Colorado a little bit and sort of where these things might touch down here. Colorado is not going to be where we solve the climate change problems by itself, but I think we all want to be thinking about what this means closer to home. The beauty of thinking about these land-based solutions is everything I'm going to talk about here are things that we've been doing anyways or should be doing. They're they're basically what we used to call just conservation, and now we might call them climate change strategies. And so the question is, what can we all do to make more of them happen? But the first is land conservation. Colorado has had an incredible history of that. We've focused a lot. We have a lot of our forest land protected, and are now focusing on our grass and shrublands, sagebrush steppe. That's a beautiful Carpenter Ranch. Those of you who haven't seen it there and want to go as an example of conserved land, and we have Susan Otis here with the Yampa Valley Land Trust as well, who does incredible work in conserving land in this part of the world. But Colorado has been a leader, and that work is, we haven't done that for climate change benefits, but there are undoubted that they are there. The second category is grazing lands and croplands. In this part of the world, most of our agricultural production is in grazing and hay production, and so the opportunities aren't, there's not as much in some of the strategies related to nutrient management and no-till agriculture and stuff. But grazing patterns and how we use planned grazing with an eye towards thinking about soil carbon over time becomes a really important piece. My inclination, and I'd love to hear from Marcia, Jay, others here, is that the opportunity for significantly increasing the productivity of our grazing lands in a place like Route County, where we've done well, we have good moisture, probably the delta is not as big, but when you begin to move even into eastern Colorado, into some of the shortgrass prairie, where there's been a lot of overgrazed land, not because necessarily there's been bad management, but just because it's very difficult there. When you get into a drought period, you can quickly go over the edge and lose your grass cover, and we've seen that in a lot of ranches, but you can use grazing patterns to rebuild that, and I think that's an enormous opportunity in Colorado. Those are Nature Conservancy bison down in the San Luis Valley. They're very good carbon storers by the way they're working down there, but that's not always an answer. But the grazing patterns of bison certainly have had great impacts on forest soil health. The category that's interesting in Colorado is our forests. I think of forests more as a problem to be avoided than a solution. Our forests are not overly productive compared even to forests elsewhere in the United States. Our forests are a little drier. They're not great places to store carbon. However, they're very much at risk, as we've seen over the last few years, from catastrophic loss due to wildfires because of their condition. And that loss does lead to enormous losses of carbon sink. There's been a recent scientific paper that suggests that forests in the United States have been a net sink for carbon. Particularly, they've actually been growing. We've been storing more because in the eastern United States, where forest land is coming back from land that had been plowed before. But we're right on a tipping point, and the tipping point is what happens to our western forest. If we lose our western forest, and we're beginning to see this in states like New Mexico and Arizona, where the weather pattern is getting to the point where they're getting fires, and they're not getting forests back. And in those systems where you lose that soil carbon, that soil is stored in that the carbon stored in that biomass, that is unlikely to come back in a shrubland system that you're seeing in a state like New Mexico. So how we restore our forests to avoid that loss is an important question. So the restoration piece there is avoided loss rather than new carbon. And then finally, talk a bit about wetlands. Every place has wetlands, and wetlands are, as we know, we've protected and been concerned about wetlands for a whole range of other reasons, but wildlife benefits, water quality benefits, in particular those two. But they're incredible stores of carbon. This is a picture from a project that the Nature Conservancy has been undertaking for the last 5 years or more in the Gunnison Basin of Colorado, where we worked with the ranchers there to look at. We started this project thinking about Gunnison sage-grouse and what was the most important thing to help keep Gunnison sage-grouse thriving there. And it was these wet meadows and these agricultural and rangeland systems. And so we've started a movement there to really catalyze restoration of these wet meadows in areas that had been incised and you had erosion happening. It helps by just slowing down the water. The projects are very simple. They're just these one-rock dams that help slow down the water flow across the landscape and build it back in. Instantly, the landscape responds. It's great for water, it's great for productivity in grass, it's great for sage grouse, but the amount of carbon that gets stored in that kind of a system, a wet system, even in a place like Colorado, per hectare per acre is enormous. And so these projects, I like to think this would be a project that we could think about in the Yampa Valley, about focusing on areas where we could do these small restoration projects for wet meadows, which help the grazing system and help that. Again, it's probably not going to solve the global climate challenge on its own, but it is an important thing to be doing on its own. So those are probably the big categories. In the land base, there's an awful lot of other things that can be happening locally for addressing our energy use. Food waste, Sarah mentioned food waste. If you tie that as a land-based thing, that obviously has a double whammy. One is producing less food can help with the climate emission, and the methane coming from landfills is enormous too. So food waste is actually an associated part of the kind of solutions we can get. So that's what I wanted to share and give you that perspective from the global context and a little bit about what could happen here. There are a number of experts in the room who know a lot about land use in Route County and can talk about some of the things and some of the opportunities that we might have that I didn't touch on. I would love to hear them, but I want to open it up for any questions and a discussion about these ideas.